My name is Eleanor, I am 35 years old, and for the last 4 years, I secretly held the deed to my parents' picture-perfect suburban home. They thought I was just their reliable, boring daughter, the human ATM who obediently funded their country club lifestyle and my golden child sister's fake wealth. They had absolutely no idea that while they were treating my 6-year-old daughter like their personal unpaid maid, I was legally their landlord. It took one dangerously broken wooden stool and a kitchen sink full of greasy water for me to finally snap and systematically evict the toxic family I had spent my entire adult life trying to please. If you're listening from somewhere far away, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this has traveled. And please, stay with me until the end, because the truth always comes to light, and sometimes the cost of that truth is everything. It was mid-November of 2025, and the Atlanta sky was already a bruising, heavy shade of purple by the time I pulled my car out of the downtown parking garage. As a senior financial risk analyst, my days were governed by data, predictive models, and strict boundaries. My personality naturally craves structure and predictability. I thrive on compliance and steadiness. I like rules, I like logic, and above all, I like a fair return on my investments. But when it came to my family, all my logic seemed to vanish into thin air. My usual nanny had called out sick that Tuesday morning with a severe stomach bug. Caught in a bind before a critical quarterly review meeting, I had made the mistake of calling my mother, Barbara. To my surprise, she had enthusiastically agreed to watch my 6-year-old daughter, Lily. Barbara had promised me over the phone that they were going to bake chocolate chip cookies, build a blanket fort, and read stories. "Don't worry about a thing, Ellie," my mother had cooed, her voice dripping with that artificial sweetness she usually reserved for the ladies at her Sunday church group. "Bring the kiddo over, we'll have a blast." I should have trusted the cold, heavy knot of anxiety twisting in my stomach the entire drive to their upscale suburban neighborhood. My parents lived in a sprawling 2-story colonial house with manicured lawns and pristine white trim. On paper, it was the American dream. In reality, it was a hollow stage set designed to make my mother look successful and wealthy to her neighbors. I parked my car in the driveway, grabbing my leather briefcase, my mind already shifting from corporate spreadsheets to the warm, comforting thought of hugging my daughter. I unlocked the heavy mahogany front door with my spare key and stepped into the foyer. I expected to smell vanilla extract and melting chocolate. I expected to hear giggling. Instead, the house smelled intensely of stale fried food and overwhelming floral air freshener. The deafening sound of an animated movie blared from the living room television. I walked quietly down the hardwood hallway and stopped at the archway of the living room. My sister Chloe's 2 daughters, 8-year-old Madison and 6-year-old Harper, were sprawled out on the cream-colored sectional sofa, the sofa I had paid for. They were wearing expensive matching boutique outfits that I knew for a fact my mother had bought them using the maintenance allowance I transferred to her bank account every single month. The 2 girls were giggling, their eyes glued to an iPad, completely oblivious to the world around them. Madison reached into a massive family-sized bag of neon orange cheese puffs, shoved a handful into her mouth, and then wiped her heavily stained, powdery fingers directly onto the pristine fabric of the couch. "Hey," I said softly, my voice tight. "Where is Lily?" Madison didn't even look up from her screen. She just lazily pointed a bright orange finger toward the back of the house. "Kitchen." A sudden, sharp spike of adrenaline hit my bloodstream. I didn't say another word to my nieces. I dropped my briefcase by the entryway console and walked quickly toward the kitchen. The scene I walked into will be burned into my memory for the rest of my life. My sweet, gentle 6-year-old Lily was not baking cookies. She was not building a blanket fort. She was standing precariously on a tall wooden bar stool that had been pushed up flush against the cold granite countertop. I knew that stool. It had been broken for months. One of the rubber feet at the bottom was missing, making the entire thing wobble dangerously every time weight shifted on it. Lily was standing on her tiptoes on that unstable piece of wood, leaning over the deep stainless steel farmhouse sink. Her tiny hands, red and raw from the hot water, were submerged in a sink full of murky, brown, grease-filled dishwater. A mountain of plates, encrusted serving bowls, and greasy pots from what looked like a massive afternoon lunch was piled dangerously high next to her. She was struggling with all her might to scrub a heavy cast iron skillet that was practically half her size. Her little pink dress, the one I had carefully ironed for her that morning, was completely soaked through the front with dirty dishwater. She was crying, not loud, theatrical sobs, but the quiet, heartbroken, silent tears of a child who has been told that her feelings do not matter. The tears were streaming down her plump cheeks, dripping off her chin, and falling soundlessly into the greasy water. For a span of about 5 seconds, the entire world went completely deaf and completely still. The analytical part of my brain, the part that evaluates risk and calculates numbers, simply short-circuited. I didn't feel anger right away. I felt a deep, profound, suffocating grief. This was the dynamic I had endured my entire life, now being passed down to the only pure thing I had ever created. My sister Chloe, at 32 years old, was the indisputable golden child. She could do absolutely no wrong. Chloe got the praise, the financial bailouts, and the unconditional support, while I was simply the family workhorse. I was the difficult one because I asked for fairness. And now, because Lily was my child, she was deemed tough enough to be their unpaid servant, while Chloe's delicate little girls were treated like suburban royalty in the living room. I closed the distance across the kitchen in 3 wide, rapid strides. I didn't yell. I didn't make a scene. I just reached out, grabbed my daughter firmly by her waist, and lifted her off that dangerous, creaking stool. Lily dropped the heavy sponge into the water with a splash. The moment she felt my arms around her, the dam broke. She threw her wet, soapy arms around my neck and buried her face into the shoulder of my tailored wool coat, finally sobbing out loud. "I've got you, baby," I whispered fiercely into her hair, holding her small, trembling body tight against my chest. The soapy, dirty water from her ruined dress seeped right through my clothes, chilling my skin, but I couldn't have cared less. I felt the rapid, terrified flutter of her little heartbeat against mine. "Mommy's right here. You are done. You are completely done." Well, look who finally decided to clock out of her little corporate gig. The grating, dismissive voice of my sister, Chloe, sliced through the kitchen. I turned around slowly, holding Lily securely on my hip. Chloe was strolling in through the sliding glass doors from the backyard patio. She was 32, but she still carried herself with the entitled, bratty energy of a high school mean girl. She was wearing a plush, designer cashmere sweater and holding a tall glass of iced tea, looking completely unbothered. Right behind her was my mother, Barbara. Barbara's hair was perfectly coiffed, her makeup flawless. She looked exactly like the picture of a devoted, loving grandmother that she desperately tried to project to the world. But her eyes were cold, hard, and entirely devoid of empathy as they locked onto me holding my crying child. "What exactly is going on here?" I asked. My voice was dangerously low, perfectly level, and completely stripped of any warmth. Barbara rolled her eyes, walking over to the kitchen island and setting her tea down with an annoyed click against the granite. "Oh, chill out, Eleanor. Stop being so dramatic. You coddle that child way too much." "I coddle her?" I repeated, my tone dropping another octave. I felt the muscles in my jaw ticking. I walked into this house to find my 6-year-old daughter balancing on a broken stool, washing a mountain of heavy pans and dirty water, while Chloe's kids are wreaking havoc on the living room sofa. "You promised me you were going to watch her." "I am watching her," Barbara snapped, crossing her arms defensively over her chest. "And part of watching her is teaching her some responsibility. You're a single mom, Ellie. You're always working. You don't have time to teach her the value of hard work. She ate the lunch we cooked so she can wash the dishes. It builds character." "She is 6 years old, Barbara," I said, entirely abandoning the word mom. "She is not your live-in maid. And where was Chloe during this character-building exercise? Why aren't Madison and Harper scrubbing cast iron skillets?" Chloe let out a loud, theatrical scoff, waving her manicured hand dismissively. "You've got to be kidding me. Madison and Harper are exhausted. They had an intense ballet class this morning. Plus, Lily actually likes helping out. Don't project your own guilt onto us just because you feel bad for dumping her here while you go push papers at your desk." The sheer, unapologetic audacity of her words hung in the stale kitchen air. Chloe had never held a steady job for more than 8 months in her entire adult life. She married Derek, a man whose ego was as massively inflated as his bank accounts were empty, and they lived almost entirely off the financial grace of my parents. Or rather, the financial grace they thought came from my parents. "I didn't dump her here," I said, my voice steady, though my heart was pounding a slow, furious rhythm against my ribs. "I asked for a favor because my nanny was sick, a favor that I pay for multiple times over every single month when I transfer your maintenance allowance." "Don't you dare throw your money in my face in my own house," Barbara hissed, taking a threatening step forward, her face flushing an angry mottled red. You think just because you wear a fancy suit and work in an office tower that you can talk down to us? You owe this family, Eleanor. I put a roof over your head for 18 years. If I tell your kid to wash a plate, she washes a plate. That's the rule under my roof. Under my roof. A bitter, hollow laugh almost escaped my throat. The delusion was absolute. The irony was so overwhelmingly thick it was practically suffocating. Before I could deliver a response, heavy, clumsy footsteps thudded down the wooden staircase in the hallway. I knew exactly who it was. The golden son-in-law. The self-proclaimed patriarch of a family he didn't even financially support. Derek rounded the corner and strolled into the kitchen. He was 35, wearing a pair of expensive athletic joggers and a fitted t-shirt. He held a sleek tablet in one hand and a cup of artisanal coffee in the other. He stopped beside Chloe, wrapping an arm around her waist, and looked at me with a sickeningly condescending smirk. "I could hear you yelling from my home office, Ellie," Derek drawled, using a nickname I absolutely despised. He didn't even bother to stand up straight, just leaned against the kitchen counter with an arrogant slouch. "You really need to keep your emotions in check. It's bad for the kids' psychology." "Your home office?" I asked, raising a single eyebrow. "You mean the guest bedroom where you play video games?" Derek's smirk tightened, his fragile male ego instantly bruised. "For your information, I am working on the markets. The price action on the EUR/USD pair is incredibly volatile today. I've been tracking a bearish divergence on the candlestick charts all morning. It's a high-level macroeconomic strategy, Ellie. I'm waiting for a breakout to secure our financial independence. It requires absolute focus, which is kind of hard to maintain when you come in here throwing a tantrum over a little soap and water." I stared at him. I stared at this chronically unemployed man who genuinely believed he was a Wall Street savant because he watched a few YouTube tutorials on Forex trading. He was burning through whatever meager savings Chloe had left, leveraging high-risk trades based on price action that he fundamentally didn't understand while living in a house I secretly owned. "You're tracking candlestick charts," I repeated slowly, letting the utter absurdity of the statement hang in the air. "Derek, you haven't had a W-2 tax form to your name in 3 years. "Hey, watch your mouth!" Chloe shrieked, instantly stepping in front of her husband like a guard dog. "Derek is a visionary. He's an entrepreneur. He's hustling to build generational wealth for our daughters, unlike you, who just works for a corporate machine. You're just a bitter, lonely woman who can't stand to see a real man stepping up as the head of the family." "The head of the family," I echoed. I looked around the expansive kitchen. I looked at the custom oak cabinets, the imported tile backsplash, the expensive stainless steel refrigerator. I looked at my mother, breathing heavily in her self-righteous fury, believing she held absolute authority. I looked at my sister, fiercely defending a parasite, and I looked at Derek, puffing his chest out, convinced of his own intellectual and financial superiority simply because he was born a man and possessed a trading app on his tablet. They were so deeply, hopelessly committed to their own illusions. They needed me to be the villain. They needed me to be the subservient, rule-following, boring daughter who would absorb their disrespect and silently write the checks that kept their fake empire afloat. I felt Lily's little hands grip the collar of my coat tighter. She sniffled quietly against my neck. In that exact fraction of a second, the internal calculus I had been wrestling with for years finally balanced out. The risk of losing my family entirely was suddenly far less terrifying than the guarantee of allowing them to break my daughter's spirit the way they had broken mine. The emotional obligation, the suffocating, unspoken black tax that demanded I drag them upward while they kicked me downward, evaporated. I didn't need to yell. I didn't need to argue with fools. I was a risk analyst, and I was officially liquidating a bad asset. "You're right, Barbara," I said softly. The sudden drop in my volume made the entire kitchen go eerily quiet. "It is your house and your rules." Barbara's posture relaxed slightly, a triumphant, smug look washing over her face. She thought she had won. She thought my calm demeanor was my usual compliance, my standard retreat into submission to avoid a messy conflict. "Glad we finally understand each other," Barbara huffed, adjusting her sweater. "Now put the girl down so she can finish the pots. I need that skillet for dinner." I didn't put Lily down. Instead, I tightened my grip around her, turned my back on the three of them, and walked calmly toward the front hallway. "Where do you think you're going?" Barbara's voice spiked with sudden panic, following me into the foyer. "Eleanor, don't you dare walk out on me when I'm speaking to you. Tomorrow is the 1st of the month. I expect your $3,500 maintenance transfer in my account by 9 a.m. sharp. The property taxes are due, and Derek needs a small loan to cover his trading margin." I stopped with my hand on the brass doorknob. I didn't turn around. I simply looked down at my sweet daughter, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to her forehead. "Don't hold your breath for that deposit, Barbara," I said to the wooden door. I turned the knob, stepped out into the biting November cold, and let the heavy front door click shut behind me, sealing them inside a house of cards that was about to spectacularly, violently collapse. The heavy oak door of my parents' house clicked shut behind me, sealing the smell of stale cooking oil and fake superiority inside. The biting mid-November wind whipped across the manicured lawn, cutting through my damp wool coat, but I welcomed the chill. It felt like walking out of a thick, suffocating fog and finally taking a breath of clean air. I carried Lily down the pristine concrete driveway to my SUV. I didn't put her down until we reached the passenger side. I popped the door open, gently set her on the leather seat, and immediately stripped off her soaked, greasy pink dress. I pulled a clean, oversized cashmere sweater from my gym bag in the trunk and wrapped her in it, bundling her up like a tiny, precious burrito before buckling her securely into her car seat. She looked up at me, her big brown eyes still red-rimmed and puffy. "Did I do a bad job, Mommy? Grandma said I wasn't scrubbing the corners right." My heart physically ached. The generational trauma, the insidious conditioning that makes women in our family believe they have to earn their keep through servitude was already trying to dig its claws into my 6-year-old. I knelt on the cold asphalt, bringing my face level with hers. I took her small, raw hands in mine. "Look at me, Lily. You did absolutely nothing wrong. Grandma was wrong. Aunt Chloe was wrong. You are a little girl, not a maid, and nobody gets to treat you like that. Ever again." She sniffled, offering a small, hesitant nod. I kissed her knuckles, shut the heavy car door, and walked around to the driver's seat. When I started the engine and the heat blasted through the vents, the adrenaline finally began to recede, leaving behind a profound, terrifying clarity. For 35 years, I had been trapped in the sunk cost fallacy of my toxic family. I had kept paying the black tax, the unspoken cultural obligation to drag your less successful, entitled relatives upward just because you share blood. I had sacrificed my peace, my boundaries, and my hard-earned money to buy my mother's approval. But sitting in the quiet hum of my car, watching my daughter's chest rise and fall as she exhausted herself to sleep in the rearview mirror, the math finally became incredibly simple. The return on investment for my family was zero. They were a toxic asset, and I was officially liquidating them. The next morning, the chaotic energy of the suburban kitchen felt like a distant, irrelevant nightmare as I stepped into my corner office in downtown Atlanta, my sanctuary. The floor-to-ceiling glass windows offered a commanding, unobstructed view of the city skyline. Up here, on the 42nd floor, I wasn't the difficult, boring daughter. I was Eleanor, a senior risk analyst who moved millions of dollars across institutional portfolios before my morning coffee. I was respected, I was feared, and most importantly, I was in absolute control. I set my briefcase on my sleek mahogany desk, smoothed my tailored blazer, and picked up my desk phone. I dialed a direct extension. The line rang twice before a crisp, professional voice answered. "Nate speaking." Nate was the senior partner at a boutique real estate law firm I kept on a very quiet retainer. He was sharp, pragmatic, and possessed the emotional detachment of a stone wall. Exactly the kind of attorney you want when you're about to wage a quiet legal war. "Nate, it's Eleanor," I said, pulling a thick manila folder from my locked desk drawer. "It's time to pull the plug." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. The rustling of papers echoed faintly. "I assume we are talking about the Lily's Future Trust portfolio?" "Exactly," I replied, opening the folder. Inside lay the original notarized mortgage note printed on heavy, watermarked bond paper. 4 years ago, right around Thanksgiving of 2021, my parents had hit absolute rock bottom. My father, Arthur, an eternally passive man who avoided conflict at all costs, had co-signed a disastrous business loan for Derek that went entirely belly up. Meanwhile, Barbara refused to stop buying expensive patio furniture and hosting catered luncheons to impress her church friends. The bank had issued a final warning. Foreclosure was imminent. They came to me crying, begging for a massive bailout loan. They swore up and down they would pay me back every single penny. But I processed data for a living. I knew that handing them a lump sum of cash was like throwing a bucket of water into a black hole. Chloe would simply spend it on designer bags, and Derek would blow the rest. So I executed a legal maneuver they were far too financially illiterate to comprehend. I didn't give my parents a loan. I hired Nate to set up an independent, ironclad trust named after my daughter. Lily's Future Trust approached their bank and quietly purchased their defaulted mortgage note in its entirety. My parents were completely oblivious. When the threatening letters from the bank suddenly stopped, they assumed the bank had simply granted them an extended hardship grace period. They thought the $3,500 I transferred into our joint checking account on the first of every month was just my way of helping them stay afloat and pay their property taxes while they supposedly got back on their feet. They had absolutely no idea that their debt wasn't forgiven. It was just transferred. I was the bank. I owned the paper. I owned the dirt beneath their feet. I need you to freeze the joint maintenance account immediately, I instructed Nate, my voice devoid of any emotion. Cancel the recurring $3,500 automated clearinghouse transfer scheduled for December 1st. Put a hard block on the routing number. As of this exact moment, they do not have access to a single cent of my capital. Understood, Nate said, the rapid clicking of his keyboard humming through the speaker. But Eleanor, you realize that without that monthly influx, they will default on their utilities and property taxes almost immediately. They are already severely delinquent on county taxes from what my paralegal flagged last month. Once they realize the tap is shut off, things are going to get incredibly ugly, incredibly fast. Let them get ugly, I said softly, staring out at the Atlanta traffic crawling along the interstate below. I'm done funding their delusions. Just execute the freeze, Nate. Consider it done. The transfer will bounce by Monday morning. I'll monitor the county clerk's office for any sudden desperate moves on their end. The trap was set. Now all I had to do was wait for the rats to realize the cheese was gone. I didn't have to wait long. December 1st arrived on a cold, overcast Monday. I was sitting at my kitchen island at home, sipping a dark roast coffee and reviewing a risk assessment matrix on my tablet. Lily was sitting happily across from me, eating a bowl of oatmeal and watching cartoons, completely safe and blissfully unaware of the storm brewing 30 miles away in the suburbs. At exactly 9:15 a.m., my personal cell phone, resting face up on the marble counter, vibrated. The screen lit up with a text message from Barbara. Hey, Ellie, did you change your bank routing number? The maintenance transfer didn't hit the joint account this morning. Call me back ASAP. I took a slow sip of my coffee. I didn't touch the phone. 10 minutes later, another text. Eleanor, stop ignoring me. The auto draft for the electric bill just bounced and I got hit with a $35 overdraft fee. This isn't funny. Fix the glitch. By 10 a.m., the annoyance in her messages had completely morphed into frantic entitlement. Pick up your phone right now. Derek has a major margin call deadline at noon and he needs that loan you promised us. We are a family, Eleanor. You can't just ghost us when we need you. A cold, humorless smile touched the corners of my mouth. A loan I promised them? The gaslighting was truly spectacular. They had somehow convinced themselves that my forced, extorted money was a guaranteed salary they were legally owed. At 10:30 a.m., the phone started actually ringing. The caller ID flashed Derek's name. I let it ring out to voicemail. He called back immediately. I let it go to voicemail again. A few moments later, the little notification bubble popped up on my screen, indicating a new audio message. I tapped play, turning the volume up slightly. Listen, Eleanor. Derek's voice filled my quiet kitchen. He was trying to sound like the calm, authoritative alpha male, but there was a distinct, high-pitched tremor of absolute panic underneath his bravado. You need to wire that $3,500 right now, plus an extra $5,000. The market makers totally manipulated the spread on the euro pairs overnight. It was a liquidity grab, totally unpredictable. The institutional algorithms hunted my stop-loss orders. I rolled my eyes. The sheer volume of buzzwords he was vomiting to cover up the fact that he was a terrible gambler was staggering. If I don't inject capital into my brokerage account by noon, they're going to liquidate my entire portfolio, Derek continued, his breathing sounding heavy and sweaty into the microphone. I'm in a temporary drawdown, but the price action is showing a massive bullish divergence. I'm about to hit the mother lode, Ellie. Do not mess this up for me because you're throwing a tantrum over Lily washing a few dishes. Be a team player. Wire the funds. The voicemail beeped and ended. I set the phone down, feeling a profound sense of peace wash over me. For years, a voicemail like that would have sent me into a spiral of anxiety. I would have felt the crushing weight of guilt, the fear of my mother's screaming wrath, the desperate need to keep the peace. I would have logged into my banking app and sent the money, hating myself with every keystroke. But today I felt absolutely nothing but a clinical, detached fascination. I was watching a parasite realize the host had severed the connection. I picked up my phone, opened the settings, and calmly blocked Derek's number. Then I blocked Chloe's. I left Barbara unblocked strictly for entertainment purposes and legal documentation. I knew exactly what would happen next. Derek was backed into a corner of his own making. He was an arrogant, desperate man who had promised my sister a life of luxury and was currently staring down the barrel of total financial ruin. Men like Derek, when stripped of their unearned confidence and free money, do not suddenly become responsible. They double down. They take massive illegal risks because their egos cannot accept failure. With my money officially cut off, Derek was going to have to find another way to fund his gambling addiction. And since he didn't have a job, a credit score, or a shred of dignity, there was only one asset left for him to exploit: the house. He was going to try to leverage the house. And the moment he tried to run a title search to secure a loan, he was going to walk directly into the titanium reinforced bear trap I had patiently left waiting for him in the dark. I locked my phone screen, wiped a smudge of oatmeal off Lily's cheek, and smiled. Let the games begin. The first 2 weeks of December 2025 were an exercise in psychological endurance. When you cut off a toxic family's funding, they don't immediately self-reflect or apologize. They cycle through the stages of financial grief: denial, entitlement, manipulation, and finally, unhinged desperation. My phone had become a fascinating case study in borderline personality dynamics. Barbara's text messages were a pendulum swinging wildly between aggressive threats and pitiful manufactured crises. December 4th, Eleanor, your father's back is acting up and we can't afford his copay because you froze the account. This is elder abuse. Call me. A lie. I paid for his premium Medicare supplement plan directly from a separate corporate account. December 8th. Ellie, please. It's freezing. The gas company sent a shut-off notice. Do you really want your nieces to freeze to death before Christmas? Another lie. I had the login credentials to their utility portal. The heating bill was fully paid through January. I didn't reply to a single one. I treated their manufactured emergencies with the same clinical detachment I used when analyzing a failing corporate bond. I simply documented them, took screenshots, and forwarded everything to my attorney, Nate. On the afternoon of December 15th, Nate's executive assistant called me. Her voice was perfectly measured, betraying no emotion. Eleanor, Nate needs you to come down to the office. He has the forensic trace on the joint account and there's been a significant development regarding the property. An hour later, I was sitting in Nate's high-rise office in Buckhead. It smelled of expensive leather, lemon polish, and billable hours. Nate sat across from me behind a massive glass desk, looking over the rim of his tortoiseshell glasses. He didn't offer small talk. He just slid a thick, heavy manila folder across the smooth glass. I pulled the county tax ledgers and ran a full forensic audit on the joint checking account you shared with your mother, Nate began, folding his hands neatly over his legal pad. You told me the $3,500 you deposited on the first of every month was strictly allocated for property taxes, homeowners insurance, and structural maintenance. That was the explicit agreement, I confirmed, feeling a sudden chill in the room. Barbara was supposed to act as the pass-through. She pays the county, she pays the insurance premiums, and they use whatever is left for basic upkeep. Right, Nate sighed, tapping a polished fingernail against the folder. Well, you might want to brace yourself, Eleanor, because they haven't paid a single dime to the county tax assessor in over 2 years. I froze. The analytical gears in my head ground to a violent halt. Excuse me? I opened the folder. Sitting right on top was a certified statement from the Fulton County Tax Commissioner. Stamped across the top in bold, glaring red ink was the word delinquent. I scanned the numbers, my eyes darting across the columns. The property was in arrears for roughly $18,000 in unpaid property taxes, plus compounding interest and late penalties. Where did the money go? I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous, hollow whisper. Over the last 4 years, I had funneled nearly $168,000 into that account. It was a staggering amount of post-tax capital. If she wasn't paying the taxes to keep the house out of a tax lien, where the hell was it going? Nate flipped to the second tab in the folder. He presented a stack of bank statements highlighted with bright yellow marker. Your mother was withdrawing roughly $1,000 a month in cash. Based on the ATM locations, she was likely funding Chloe's lifestyle. Boutiques, salons, expensive groceries. The usual, Nate explained calmly. But the bulk of your money, the other $2,500 a month, he pointed to a series of outgoing wire transfers. It was being transferred out exactly 2 days after your deposit cleared. The destination routing numbers trace back to a high-leverage retail forex brokerage registered in Cyprus, an offshore trading platform known for predatory margin lending. The breath completely left my lungs. The sheer, blinding audacity of it hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Derek. Derek wasn't just losing his own money. He wasn't just burning through Chloe's non-existent savings. He was systematically stealing the money I had bled for, the money I had worked 80-hour weeks to earn, to fund his delusional gambling addiction. He was playing Wall Street with the literal roof over his family's head. And my mother, the woman who constantly berated me for not contributing enough, was aiding and abetting him. She was actively hiding the tax delinquency notices so her golden son-in-law could keep pretending he was an entrepreneur. A dark, incredibly cold fury settled into my bones. It wasn't the hot, chaotic anger of my 20s. It was the icy, absolute resolve of a woman who realizes she owes these people absolutely nothing. They let the house fall into a tax delinquency just to feed his gambling habit, I murmured, tracing the offshore wire transfer amounts with my index finger. It gets worse, Nate said, his tone entirely unapologetic. That's not why I called you in here today. I looked up, meeting his sharp gaze. How could it possibly get worse? Nate pulled a single sheet of paper from his own notebook and placed it gently on top of the bank statements. It was a digital alert notification from a title monitoring service. When you froze the account on December 1st, Derek missed a massive margin call on his offshore platform. His positions were liquidated. He is completely, totally broke, Nate explained, leaning back in his leather chair. Desperate men do desperate things, Eleanor. 2 days ago, a company called Apex Bridge Capital initiated a hard pull on the property's title. I frowned, my risk analyst brain immediately recognizing the name. Apex? They're a predatory hard money lender. They do high-interest, short-term bridge loans, the kind of loans you only take if traditional banks won't even look at you. Exactly, Nate nodded. Derek applied for a $200,000 home equity line of credit. He tried to leverage the house to get the cash he desperately needs to cover his trading debts and get back in the market. But Derek's name isn't on the deed, I pointed out, my heart starting to pound, a slow, heavy rhythm. Even before I bought the note, the house was strictly in my father's name, Arthur. Which means, Nate said, steepling his fingers, in order to initiate the loan application with Apex, Derek had to forge your father's signature on the preliminary paperwork. He likely bypassed your father completely, assuming he could get the cash, win it back on the market, and pay off the loan before Arthur or Barbara ever found out. The absolute criminal stupidity of the man was breathtaking. He had committed wire fraud, forgery, and attempted mortgage fraud in the span of a single week. So, what happened when Apex ran the title? I asked, already knowing the answer, but needing to hear it out loud. A rare, razor-thin smile appeared on Nate's face. The underwriter at Apex pulled the county deed records to verify the collateral. They were expecting to see Arthur's name. Instead, they hit a concrete wall. The records clearly show that the property is owned entirely, free and clear, by an independent corporate entity, Lily's Future Trust. I closed my eyes, letting out a long, shaky exhale. The trap had sprung. The jaws had snapped completely shut. Apex immediately denied the loan, Nate continued, his voice crisp with professional satisfaction. But hard money lenders aren't known for their discretion. The loan officer called the primary residence number, your parents' landline, to inform the applicant why the loan was categorically denied. I have it on very good authority that your mother answered the phone. My eyes snapped open. Barbara knows. Oh, Barbara definitely knows, Nate confirmed. She found out about an hour ago that she doesn't own her house. She found out her son-in-law forged her husband's signature. And she found out the name of the trust holding the deed. Right on cue, as if summoned by the sheer force of her own narcissistic rage, my cell phone began to vibrate violently inside my leather handbag. I reached into the bag and pulled the phone out. The caller ID flashed brightly. Barbara. Home. I looked at the screen, then looked up at Nate. He simply gestured toward the phone with an open palm. You're off the clock, Eleanor. Take the call. I swiped the green button, put the phone on speaker, and set it down on the glass desk. I didn't say hello. I just let the silence stretch. Eleanor! The scream that erupted from the phone speaker was so loud, so completely unhinged, that Nate actually flinched slightly in his chair. It wasn't just anger. It was the raw, primal shriek of a woman whose entire meticulously crafted reality had just been atomized. Eleanor, what have you done? Barbara shrieked, her voice cracking with hysteria. I could hear things crashing in the background, glass shattering against hardwood. Who is Apex Capital? Why did a loan officer just call my house asking for Derek? And what the hell is Lily's future trust? I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the cool glass desk. My voice, when I spoke, was the auditory equivalent of liquid nitrogen. Lily's future trust, I enunciated clearly, is the legal entity that I manage. It is also the sole legal owner of the property you are currently standing in. You're lying, Barbara roared, her breathing ragged and frantic. You are a liar. We own this house. We have a mortgage with the bank. I have been paying the bank for 30 years. You haven't paid the bank a single cent in 4 years, Barbara, I corrected her, keeping my tone terrifyingly calm. 4 years ago, when Dad co-signed that idiotic loan for Derek and the bank was about to put you on the street, I didn't give you a bailout. I bought your defaulted note directly from the bank. Dead silence fell over the line. Only the sound of my mother's rapid, hyperventilating breaths echoed through Nate's office. For 4 years, I continued, twisting the knife with surgical precision. You thought the bank was just being generous. You thought the $3,500 I sent you every month was my duty as a daughter, but you didn't even use it for the property taxes, did you, Barbara? You handed my hard-earned money to Derek so he could gamble it away on the foreign exchange market. How do you know about that? Barbara whispered. The aggression had instantly evaporated, replaced by cold, naked terror. I am a senior risk analyst, Mother. I know everything, I said, and because you enabled a degenerate gambler instead of paying the county taxes, the house is severely delinquent. Derek just tried to forge Dad's signature to take out a second mortgage to cover his massive trading losses. He thought he could leverage equity that didn't exist. No, Barbara babbled, her voice dropping into a panicked, pleading whimper. Derek said he was building a portfolio. He said the money was safe. Ellie, you have to fix this. You have to sign the house back over to us. If Derek's loan didn't go through, those people, the people he owes money to on the trading platforms, they're going to come after him. Even now, even with the absolute truth staring her in the face, her first instinct was to protect the golden son-in-law. She was standing in the ruins of her own home, begging the daughter she despised to save the man who had just stolen her future. Derek's financial liabilities are not my problem, I said smoothly. And neither is your housing situation. My housing situation? Barbara screamed, the panic morphing back into desperate fury. This is my home. You cannot do this. You are my daughter. I will take you to court. I will sue you for fraud. You can certainly try, I replied, looking at Nate, who gave a slow, confirming nod. But when we go to court, the process of discovery works both ways. My forensic accountants will gladly submit the bank records proving you knowingly misappropriated funds to fund an offshore gambling addiction, while Derek committed wire fraud and forgery. We'll see how well your country club friends respond when Derek is facing a federal indictment. A choked, pathetic sob tore out of my mother's throat. She was completely cornered, entirely out of moves. Oh, and Barbara, I added, my voice dropping to a final, definitive whisper. Since you like rules and discipline so much, here's a new rule for you. You will never, ever disrespect my daughter again. Enjoy your afternoon. I reached forward and tapped the red button, cutting off her hysterical weeping instantly. The silence that reclaimed Nate's office was exquisite. It felt heavy, permanent, and incredibly clean. Nate took off his glasses, pulled a microfiber cloth from his desk drawer, and began polishing the lenses. He didn't look up, but a genuine smirk played on his lips. Well, Nate murmured, holding his glasses up to the light. I believe the technical legal term for what just happened is checkmate. I stood up, gathered my coat, and picked up my purse. Not yet, Nate. They still haven't truly paid the price. Draft the official eviction notices. Keep them locked in your desk. We are going to let them sweat for a few days. As I walked out of the law firm and stepped into the crisp December air, the city of Atlanta felt entirely different. The suffocating weight of my childhood was gone. My family's fake empire was burning to the ground, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't going to be the one to extinguish the flames. I was just going to watch it burn. For exactly 5 days following my meeting at Nate's office, my phone was completely, blissfully silent. In the past, my mother's radio silence was a carefully calculated weapon. It was the psychological equivalent of holding her breath until she turned blue. Barbara's strategy was always to cut off communication, manufacture a sense of impending doom, and wait for my deeply ingrained childhood anxiety to kick in. She expected me to crack, to call her apologizing for whatever boundary I had dared to set, and to offer my checkbook as a peace offering. But sitting in my quiet, sunlit living room with a cup of Earl Grey tea, watching Lily meticulously color a picture of a snowman, I realized the conditioning was entirely broken. I didn't feel the familiar, tight squeeze of panic in my chest. I didn't care if Barbara never spoke to me again. I spent those 5 days compiling what I privately referred to as the Christmas dossier. Nate's paralegal had securely emailed me the complete forensic breakdown of Derek's trading history, tied directly to the wire transfers from my mother's joint account. As a risk analyst, reading Derek's financial footprint was like reading the diary of a remarkably confident idiot. He wasn't even trading traditional blue-chip stocks. He was playing with heavily leveraged, exotic foreign exchange pairs, specifically the Turkish lira and the Japanese yen, using an offshore brokerage that offered 100-to-1 margin. In layman's terms, for every $1 real Derek had, the broker let him gamble with 100 fake ones. When the market moved against him by even a fraction of a percent, his entire actual balance was instantly wiped out to cover the spread. He hadn't just lost my $168,000. Because he had continued to chase his losses, borrowing against imaginary future gains, he was currently sitting in a 6-figure hole with creditors who didn't care about his visionary macroeconomic strategies. That was why he had tried to forge my father's signature on the Apex Capital loan. He wasn't trying to build wealth. He was trying to stop the bleeding before someone showed up at his front door to collect. And my mother, in her desperate bid to keep Chloe's suburban fantasy intact, had handed him the matches to burn the house down. On the morning of December 20th, my phone finally rang. I glanced at the screen. It wasn't Barbara. It was my father, Arthur. Arthur was a 65-year-old retired middle manager who had spent his entire adult life blending into the wallpaper to avoid my mother's wrath. He was the ultimate enabler. He never raised his voice, never set a boundary, and never defended me. Whenever Barbara went on the warpath, Arthur simply retreated to his garage to organize his tools. Sending him to call me was Barbara's ultimate, desperate pivot. She knew her threats were useless now that I held the deed, so she was deploying the helpless old man routine. I tapped the screen and brought the phone to my ear. "Hello, Dad?" "Ellie, sweetheart." Arthur's voice was soft, hesitant, and dripping with a manufactured weariness that made my skin crawl. "How are you? How's my favorite granddaughter?" "Lily is fine," I said, keeping my voice perfectly neutral. I didn't offer a reciprocal, "How are you?" I wasn't going to read the script. A heavy, awkward pause hung on the line. I could hear the faint sound of a television playing in the background. Finally, Arthur cleared his throat. "Listen, Ellie, your mother is an absolute wreck. She hasn't been sleeping. She's just pacing the floors." He let out a heavy, theatrical sigh. "I know things got a little heated the other day on the phone. You know how your mother gets when she's stressed? Her blood pressure spikes, and she just says things she doesn't mean." "She committed financial fraud, Dad," I replied, stating the fact as casually as if I were giving him the weather forecast. "She took money designated for property taxes and wired it to an offshore gambling platform. That isn't a stress response. That's a felony." Arthur stammered, clearly thrown off balance by my refusal to sugarcoat the situation. "Now hold on, Ellie. Let's not use words like fraud. Derek made some aggressive investments. He was trying to provide for Chloe and the girls. He's an entrepreneur, and sometimes businesses take a hit. He just needs a little runway to correct the market dip. He actually has a whole prospectus drawn up to show you how he's going to double the return by Q2. I I closed my eyes and pinched the bridge of my nose. A prospectus. The man was facing total ruin, and he was still trying to pitch me a PowerPoint presentation. "Why are you calling, Arthur?" I asked, dropping the word Dad. "It's Christmas, Ellie," he said, his voice dropping into a low, pleading register. "Christmas Eve is on Wednesday. We're having the traditional prime rib dinner. Your aunts and uncles are coming over. The pastor and his wife will be here. We are a family, and families stick together when things get tough. Derek wants to sit down with you, man to man, well, professional to professional, and explain the numbers. He's very humble about this whole misunderstanding. Just come to dinner. Bring Lily. Let's put this ugly business behind us and remember what the holiday is really about." I looked at the thick stack of bank statements sitting on my kitchen counter. I looked at the county tax delinquency notice. They weren't inviting me to dinner to apologize. They were inviting me to an ambush. Barbara knew that confronting me aggressively had failed spectacularly. So she was changing the venue. She was going to pack her dining room with our extended relatives and her church friends, an audience of conservative, traditional people who firmly believed in unconditional family loyalty and the absolute authority of elders. She was going to use the audience to corner me. She would put on a tearful, Oscar-worthy performance about forgiveness and the holiday spirit, banking on the fact that I wouldn't have the stomach to cause a public scene. She expected the social pressure of the perfect Christmas to force me into signing the house over to them. It was a brilliantly manipulative, utterly toxic strategy, and it was going to backfire with the force of a freight train. "All right," I said smoothly, my voice completely devoid of any edge. "Tell Barbara we'll be there on Wednesday. 7 o'clock, right?" Arthur let out a massive, shuddering breath of relief. Yes, 7 o'clock. "Oh, Ellie, thank you. You have a good heart. You're a good daughter. I knew you wouldn't turn your back on us. We'll see you Wednesday." He hung up before I could change my mind. I set the phone down on the marble counter. A good daughter. The words tasted like ash. I walked over to my home office, logged onto my computer, and sent a quick email to my assistant. I asked her to run by a high-end office supply store on her lunch break. I needed 6 premium, heavyweight black presentation folders. If Derek wanted to present his numbers to the family, I was going to make sure everyone at the table had a copy. December 24th was bitterly cold. A thin, hard layer of frost coated the lawns of the upscale suburban neighborhood as I drove my SUV down my parents' street. The visual hypocrisy of my family's home was staggering. While the county tax commissioner was drafting a lien against the property, the exterior of the house was aggressively decorated. Thousands of expensive, ice-white LED lights dripped from the gutters. 2 massive glowing wire reindeer stood proudly on the front lawn. A custom-made, oversized holiday wreath adorned the mahogany front door. Parked in the driveway was Chloe's leased Lexus SUV, gleaming under the streetlights. They were completely broke, heavily in debt, and living in a house they didn't own, yet they were still desperately clinging to the aesthetic of upper-middle-class wealth. I parked my car on the street directly behind my Uncle George's sedan. I turned off the engine and looked at Lily in the rearview mirror. She was wearing a beautiful dark green velvet dress, her thick curls pinned back with a matching bow. "Are we going to have to do chores tonight, Mommy?" she asked quietly, her small hands gripping her seatbelt straps. "Absolutely not," I promised her, unbuckling my own seatbelt. "Tonight, you are just going to eat dinner, open your presents, and sit right next to me. If anyone asks you to do anything, you tell them to talk to your mother. Understood?" She nodded, a small, trusting smile appearing on her face. I grabbed my heavy leather tote from the passenger seat. Inside were 6 identical black folders, crisp and heavy with the weight of absolute, undeniable truth. We walked up the concrete driveway, our breath pluming in the freezing air. I didn't knock. I pushed the front door open and stepped into the foyer. The heat of the house hit me first, followed immediately by the rich, heavy smell of roasting prime rib, garlic, and expensive red wine. The house was loud. Classic Christmas jazz played through the built-in ceiling speakers. The sound of clinking glasses and boisterous laughter echoed from the formal dining room down the hall. I helped Lily take off her coat, hung it neatly in the hall closet, and walked toward the noise. The dining room was a masterclass in suburban theater. The long mahogany table was set with Barbara's finest china, crystal wine glasses, and a massive, elaborate centerpiece of fresh pine and winter berries. My Uncle George and Aunt Shirley were seated near the middle, nursing glasses of bourbon and laughing loudly. The pastor of my mother's church, Reverend Davis, and his wife sat opposite them, nodding along to whatever story was being told. At the far end of the table sat Chloe. She was wearing a stunning, clearly brand new silk blouse, a heavy gold necklace resting against her collarbone. She was holding court, gesturing with a glass of champagne as she bragged to Aunt Shirley about her daughter's elite private gymnastics coach. And standing at the head of the table, carving the massive, expensive cut of meat with an electric knife, was Derek. He wore a crisp button-down shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms to show off his luxury watch. He looked completely relaxed. He looked like the provider. The moment I stepped into the archway, the laughter began to taper off. Barbara emerged from the kitchen, carrying a silver tray of roasted vegetables. When she saw me, her entire body went rigid for a fraction of a second. But then, the mask slid perfectly into place. A wide, bright, entirely fake smile stretched across her face. "Ellie! Lily!" Barbara cheered loudly, making sure the entire table was looking at her. She set the tray down and rushed over, throwing her arms around me in a suffocating, perfume-heavy hug. She leaned in close to my ear, her voice dropping to a harsh, barely audible whisper amidst the embrace. "Play nice. Do not embarrass us in front of the Reverend." As she pulled back, beaming for the audience, "Oh, look at my beautiful granddaughter. Come here, Lily. Let Grandma give you a squeeze." Lily stiffened slightly, but allowed the hug. "Eleanor, so glad you could make it," Uncle George boomed from his seat, raising his glass. "Your dad said you were tied up with some big corporate numbers this week. Good to see you stepping away from the desk to be with family." "Family is the most important thing, George," Derek chimed in, setting the carving knife down. He wiped his hands on a linen napkin and offered me a magnanimous, forgiving smile. It was the smile of a king pardoning a peasant. "Have a seat, Ellie. There's plenty of food. We've got a lot of great things to celebrate tonight." I didn't smile back. I simply guided Lily to the 2 empty chairs near the foot of the table, opposite the pastor and his wife. I placed my heavy leather tote carefully on the floor beside my chair. "Yes, Derek," I said, my voice cutting through the warm, festive noise of the room like a shard of ice. "We do have a lot to discuss." Chloe rolled her eyes, taking a large sip of her champagne. "Oh, please, Eleanor, don't bring your depressing office energy to the dinner table. It's Christmas Eve. Keep it light." "Don't worry, Chloe," I replied, pulling my chair out. "I brought exactly what this family asked for." I sat down, feeling the reassuring weight of the tote bag against my calf. The trap was fully populated. The audience was seated, their plates were full, and their glasses were topped off. My mother had built this stage to corner me into submission, completely unaware that she had just locked the doors to her own execution. I looked down the length of the mahogany table, making brief, direct eye contact with my mother, then my sister, and finally the golden son-in-law. "So, Derek," I said calmly, resting my hands flat on the fine linen tablecloth. "Dad mentioned you had a prospectus you wanted to share with me regarding your recent investments. Why don't we start there?" The air in the formal dining room shifted instantly. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible drop in temperature, like the moment right before a summer thunderstorm breaks. The low hum of festive conversation, the clinking of heavy silver cutlery against fine china, and the smooth jazz playing from the built-in speakers seemed to dial back just a fraction. My Uncle George, who was halfway through buttering a dinner roll, paused, his bushy eyebrows furrowing in confusion. Reverend Davis and his wife exchanged a brief, polite glance, sensing an underlying tension they weren't privy to. At the head of the table, Derek's confident, magnanimous smile faltered. His hand, which had just reached for his wineglass, froze midair. He looked down the length of the mahogany table at me, his eyes narrowing slightly, trying to gauge if I was setting a trap or genuinely handing him the floor. He chose to believe the latter. His ego simply couldn't comprehend any other reality. Derek cleared his throat, adjusting the collar of his crisp button-down shirt. He shot a quick, reassuring look at my mother, Barbara, who was standing rigidly near the kitchen archway, clutching a serving tray so tightly her knuckles were white. "Well, Ellie," Derek began, his voice taking on that familiar, patronizing tone, the one he usually reserved for explaining basic concepts to women he deemed intellectually inferior. "I appreciate you bringing it up. It shows a real maturity on your part to want to understand the larger macroeconomic picture." I leaned back in my chair, resting one hand lightly on Lily's shoulder to keep her calm. "I'm all ears, Derek. Paint the picture." "As you know," Derek said, puffing his chest out slightly for the benefit of Uncle George and the Reverend, "the global financial markets have been experiencing unprecedented volatility this quarter. The geopolitical shifts affecting the Eurozone created some incredibly unique arbitrage opportunities. I've been aggressively managing a high-leverage portfolio to capitalize on these micro fluctuations." Fascinating, I deadpanned, watching Chloe take a large, nervous gulp of her champagne. And how did that strategy pan out for your fourth quarter returns? Derek's jaw tightened. The buzzwords weren't working. He realized he needed to pivot to the emotional manipulation tactic they had rehearsed. He lowered his voice, adopting a somber, humble expression. He placed his hands flat on the table, looking like a weary, noble captain addressing his crew. Look, Eleanor, I'm a man who takes big risks to secure a legacy for my family, for Chloe, for Madison, and Harper. I don't just sit in a cubicle and play it safe with mutual funds. I swing for the fences, and sometimes even the most robust trading algorithms experience a temporary drawdown. A drawdown, I repeated, tasting the word. It was a sterile, clinical term for losing every single penny you had. How temporary? Barbara suddenly rushed forward, slamming the silver tray of roasted vegetables onto the table with a loud, aggressive clatter. The noise made Lily jump slightly in her seat. All right, that's enough shop talk, Barbara announced loudly, her voice shrill and trembling with manufactured cheer. It's Christmas Eve. We are not going to talk about business right now. We are going to eat this beautiful prime rib. We are going to say grace, and we are going to be thankful for the roof over our heads. She emphasized the word roof, glaring pointedly at me. It was a desperate attempt to regain control of the narrative, to remind me of my supposed filial duty in front of an audience of her peers. Actually, Barbara, I said, my voice cutting through her shrill interruption like a scalpel, I think Derek was just about to ask me for a favor, a very large favor involving that exact roof. Weren't you, Derek? Uncle George put his butter knife down. The silence in the dining room was now absolute. Even the jazz music seemed to have faded into the background. Derek's face flushed a deep, ugly shade of red. He looked at Arthur, my father, who was staring intently at his empty plate, completely unwilling to intervene. He looked at Chloe, who was chewing her bottom lip, her eyes darting between me and her husband. He was cornered, and he hated me for it. Fine, Derek snapped, dropping the humble provider act. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, aggressively invading the shared space. Since you want to do this right now, fine. I had a liquidity issue this month, a margin call on a massive Forex position that the broker maliciously liquidated. It wasn't my fault. It was institutional market manipulation. I lost my capital. He paused, taking a deep breath, trying to regain his composure. He looked at the pastor, then back at me, playing the role of the unjustly wronged family man. I need a bridge loan, Eleanor, a substantial one, to cover the margin debt and get back into a position to recover the funds. Your mother and father graciously offered to leverage the equity in this house, their house, to secure a home equity line of credit for me. It's a guaranteed return. I have the prospectus right here on my phone to prove it. And, I prompted, knowing exactly where this was going. And, Derek spat, the venom leaking into his voice. When the lender pulled the title, they found a shell company, some trust called Lily's Future. They blocked the loan. They said Arthur doesn't own the property, so we need you to sign a quitclaim deed tomorrow morning. Transfer the title back to Arthur and Barbara so I can secure the funding and save this family's financial future. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of the demand hung in the air above the roasted vegetables and the crystal glasses. He wasn't asking for help. He was demanding that I hand over a multi-$100,000 asset so he could continue feeding an offshore gambling addiction. Reverend Davis cleared his throat, looking incredibly uncomfortable. Now, Derek, son, perhaps family financial matters are best discussed privately. No, Reverend, it's fine, Barbara interrupted, her voice rising in pitch. She walked around the table and stood behind my chair, placing a heavy, restraining hand on my shoulder. Her fingers dug painfully into my collarbone. Eleanor has always been a little difficult when it comes to sharing, but she's a good girl. She knows that family comes first. She knows that Derek is trying to build something real for her sister. She'll sign the paper. Won't you, Ellie? It was the ultimate ambush, the guilt trip, the public pressure, the physical intimidation of her hand gripping my shoulder. She was squeezing, silently demanding my submission. She thought I was still the 20-something girl who would cry in her car after writing them a check just to make the screaming stop. I reached up, placed my hand over my mother's, and peeled her fingers off my shoulder with deliberate, humiliating force. I dropped her hand as if it were something filthy. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't yell. I simply reached down to the floor beside my chair and picked up my heavy leather tote bag. I didn't come here to sign a quitclaim deed, Barbara, I said smoothly, unzipping the tote. I came here to deliver a prospectus of my own. I pulled out the 6 premium heavyweight black presentation folders I had prepared that morning. They were sleek, professional, and completely devoid of any holiday cheer. I handed the first folder to my Uncle George, who took it hesitantly. I handed the second to the Reverend. I slid the third down the table to Chloe. The fourth went to my father, Arthur. I placed the fifth directly in front of my mother's empty place setting, and the final folder I slid down the polished mahogany directly toward Derek. "What is this?" Uncle George asked, adjusting his reading glasses. "That, Uncle George," I announced, leaning back in my chair and crossing my legs, "is the documented history of this family's macroeconomic strategy over the last 4 years." Derek stared at the black folder sitting in front of him as if it were a live grenade. He didn't touch it. His face was entirely devoid of color. "Go ahead, Derek. Open it," I commanded, my voice echoing with absolute authority. "Show the Reverend exactly how you manage risk." When Derek didn't move, Uncle George opened his folder. The heavy, glossy pages inside were not filled with colorful charts or optimistic projections. They were filled with highlighted bank statements, official county tax delinquency notices, and forensic audit summaries printed on my attorney's formal letterhead. "Good Lord," Uncle George muttered, his eyes widening behind his glasses as he scanned the first page. "Eleanor, is this right? You've been depositing $3,500 a month into their account?" "Every single month for 48 months, George," I confirmed, never taking my eyes off Derek. "It was explicitly designated for property taxes, homeowners insurance, and basic maintenance to keep my parents afloat after Derek bankrupted them the first time." Chloe let out a sharp, defensive gasp. "Derek didn't bankrupt them. That was a bad business partnership. He was a victim of the supply chain." "Turn to page 3, Chloe," I instructed her coldly, "and read where the money actually went." Chloe's hands trembled as she flipped the heavy pages. Her eyes darted across the highlighted columns. Her face, previously flushed with champagne and arrogance, instantly drained of all blood. What is this?" Chloe whispered, her voice barely audible. "Owanda? Forex? What are these wire transfers?" "Those, Chloe, are the offshore retail brokerage accounts where your visionary husband has been wiring my money," I explained, projecting my voice so everyone at the table could hear clearly. "Exactly 2 days after my deposit cleared every month, Derek withdrew the funds and leveraged them 100 to 1 on currency pairs. He wasn't building a business. He was gambling on an unregulated platform from his phone in the guest bedroom." The silence in the room shattered. "Gambling?" Uncle George roared, slamming his fist onto the table, making the silverware jump. He glared at Derek with absolute disgust. "You took Eleanor's money to play the foreign exchange market? You told me last month you were raising seed capital for a logistics startup." "It wasn't gambling," Derek shouted, finally finding his voice. He stood up abruptly, his chair screeching violently against the hardwood floor. He pointed a shaking finger at me. "It was calculated speculation. I had a system. The institutional banks hunted my stops. I was providing liquidity to the market." "You provided liquidity to a scam broker in Cyprus, you absolute moron," I fired back, my voice dripping with pure contempt. "You took $168,000 of my post-tax income and you flushed it down a toilet. And to make matters worse, you let the property taxes go unpaid. Turn to page 5, everyone." The sound of rustling paper filled the room. "That is a certified notice from the Fulton County Tax Commissioner," I announced. "This house, the house you are all currently eating prime rib inside, is severely delinquent. It is carrying nearly $20,000 in unpaid taxes and penalties because Derek needed the cash to cover his margin calls." Reverend Davis looked horrified. He closed the folder and gently pushed it away from him, as if the paper itself were toxic. "Arthur. Barbara. Is this true? Have you not been paying your taxes?" Arthur buried his face in his hands, completely broken. He couldn't even look at the pastor, but Barbara wasn't broken. She was cornered, and like a rabid animal, she lashed out. "You did this!" Barbara screamed, her voice echoing shrilly off the dining room walls. She lunged across the space between us, pointing a trembling finger directly at my face. "You set this up. You froze the account on purpose just to humiliate us in front of the church. You are a vindictive, hateful girl." "I froze the account because I refused to fund a degenerate gambler, Barbara," I replied calmly. "He is your brother-in-law," she shrieked, tears of rage and humiliation streaming down her perfectly contoured face. He is trying to support your sister. You have more money than you know what to do with. You sit in your fancy office and judge us. You could have just paid the taxes yourself. You own the house. The admission hung in the air, thick and devastating. Chloe's head snapped up. She looked at her mother, then at me, her eyes wide with shock. Wait, what did she just say? Eleanor owns the house? Turn to page 1, Chloe, I said softly. Chloe frantically flipped back to the front of the folder. She stared at the copy of the original mortgage note, legally transferred and recorded 4 years prior. She read the name of the managing entity aloud, her voice shaking. Lily's Future Trust. And she looked at my 6-year-old daughter, who was sitting quietly beside me, eating a dinner roll. Then she looked back at me. You bought the house 4 years ago? Yes, I confirmed. When Dad co-signed Derek's first failed loan and the bank was going to foreclose, I didn't give them cash. I bought the debt. I am the sole legal owner of this property. Your parents are my tenants, and as of this month, they are severely delinquent tenants. Chloe's entire worldview collapsed in real time. The illusion of her parents' wealth, the security of her inheritance, the superiority she felt over her boring corporate sister, it was all completely obliterated by a single sheet of paper. She turned slowly to look at Derek. He was standing at the head of the table, sweating profusely, looking like a trapped rat. You knew, Chloe whispered, her voice trembling with rising hysteria. You tried to take out a second mortgage on a house we didn't even own. You forged Dad's signature. You lost $168,000 of her money, and you lost whatever savings we had left. Baby, I can explain, Derek stammered, holding his hands up defensively. The market was rigged. The central banks manipulated the interest rates. I just need a little more capital to average down my positions. I can win it back. I swear. You lying parasite, Chloe shrieked. The pristine, wealthy suburban housewife act vanished entirely. She grabbed her heavy crystal champagne flute and hurled it directly at Derek. The glass missed his head by inches and shattered violently against the dining room wall, raining sharp shards and expensive alcohol over the expensive wallpaper. Lily gasped, shrinking back in her chair. I immediately put my arm around her, shielding her from the chaos. Chloe, stop it, Barbara yelled, rushing forward to grab her daughter's arm. Not in front of the Reverend. Get off me, Chloe screamed, violently shoving her mother away. She turned her fury entirely onto Barbara. You knew about this. You had to know. He couldn't have wired that money without your signature on the joint account. You let him gamble away our security just so you could keep up appearances. The dining room erupted into absolute unmitigated pandemonium. Uncle George was shouting at Arthur to be a man and take control of his house. Arthur was weeping silently into his napkin. Derek was backing away toward the kitchen, terrified of his wife. Chloe was screaming obscenities that made the pastor's wife cover her ears, and Barbara was frantically trying to clean up the shattered glass while simultaneously defending her golden son-in-law. It was a spectacular, devastating collapse of a fake empire, and I had triggered the demolition with a single stack of paper. I didn't yell, I didn't gloat, I simply stood up, picked up my leather tote bag, and took Lily's hand. Come on, sweetie, I said softly to my daughter, ignoring the screaming adults around me. We're leaving. I guided her out of the dining room and down the hallway. I pulled her heavy velvet coat from the closet and helped her put it on, buttoning it carefully against the cold. As I reached for the front door, heavy, frantic footsteps pounded down the hallway behind me. Eleanor, wait! I turned around. It was Derek. He looked entirely disheveled. The arrogant smirk was completely gone, replaced by the wild, desperate eyes of a man who realized he had run completely out of road. Ellie, please, Derek begged, his voice cracking. He was actually wringing his hands together. You can't leave. You have to help me. Chloe is going to leave me. The creditors, the guys I borrowed from to cover the margin, they aren't like banks. They know where I live. You have the money. You can bail me out. Just this one last time. I swear on my life I'll never trade again. I looked at him. I looked at the man who had insulted my career, belittled my intelligence, and tried to steal my daughter's inheritance to feed his own ego. I felt absolutely no pity. You're right about one thing, Derek, I said, my voice cold and hard as the frost outside. They do know where you live. I reached into my tote bag one last time and pulled out a single crisp white envelope. It wasn't a presentation folder. It was an official legal document, stamped and notarized by Fulton County. I held it out to him. Derek took it with a trembling hand. He looked down at the bold black ink printed across the front. Official notice to vacate. 14-day eviction warning. I suggest you start packing, I told him quietly, because this house no longer belongs to you, and neither does my money. I turned my back on him, opened the heavy mahogany door, and walked out into the freezing, silent Christmas Eve night, leaving the toxic wreckage of my family completely behind me. Christmas morning in my downtown condo was quiet. It wasn't the tense, walking on eggshell silence I had grown up with, where every dropped fork or misplaced wrapping paper could trigger one of my mother's legendary, ruinous tantrums. It was the soft, genuinely peaceful quiet of a true sanctuary. Snow had dusted the Atlanta streets overnight, a rare, beautiful occurrence that made the city look like a snow globe from our 42nd floor windows. Lily and I sat on the plush living room rug in our matching flannel pajamas, drinking hot cocoa with extra marshmallows. Soft, instrumental holiday music played in the background as she tore into her presents, her face lighting up with pure, unadulterated joy. There were no passive-aggressive comments about my parenting. There was no Chloe subtly bragging about how much more expensive her kids' presents were. There was no Derek aggressively explaining the global supply chain while eating food he didn't buy. It was just us, and it was perfect. But while my condo was a fortress of peace, I knew the sprawling colonial house 30 miles away in the suburbs was a war zone. When you strip away the fake money and the unearned arrogance from a family built entirely on a foundation of narcissism and appearances, loyalty doesn't just fracture. It completely disintegrates. Toxic people do not band together in a crisis. They immediately look for someone else to throw under the bus so they don't have to take the impact. I didn't have to guess what was happening. My phone's blocked voicemail transcription app painted a vivid, high-definition picture of the carnage. While Lily was busy setting up her new dollhouse, I sat at the kitchen island with my coffee and scrolled through the transcripts from the night before. The fallout from the Christmas Eve ambush had been spectacularly ugly. The first voicemail, timestamped at 11:45 p.m. on Christmas Eve, was from Derek. "Ellie, pick up the damn phone. You can't just drop a bomb like that and walk out." Chloe took the girls and locked herself in the guest room. "She won't even look at me. Your mother is threatening to call the cops on me. You have to wire me 50 grand right now so I can fix this, or I swear to God I'm going to drag your corporate name through the mud." I deleted it. The threats of a broke, desperate man held absolutely zero leverage. The second voicemail, timestamped at 2:15 a.m. on Christmas morning, was from my sister. Chloe's voice wasn't her usual arrogant, bratty drawl. It was a hysterical, hyperventilating shriek. "Eleanor, you ruined my life. You completely ruined my life. How could you not tell me he was gambling? How could you just sit there and let me look like an idiot in front of Aunt Shirley and the Reverend? Derek is a loser. I'm completely broke, Eleanor. My credit cards are maxed out because he told me to float his business expenses. You have to let me and the girls move into your condo. I'm leaving him. I'm not going down with a degenerate gambler." I paused, reading the transcript a second time. A cold, cynical laugh escaped my lips. There it was. The grand, traditional Shia perfect marriage Chloe had constantly rubbed in my face as proof of her superiority. She had spent years telling me I was a bitter, lonely woman because I was a single mother. She had praised Derek as a visionary provider. But the absolute second the illusion of his wealth vanished, the moment she realized she was married to a liability instead of an ATM, she bounced. She didn't offer to stand by her man, get a job, or help him rebuild. She immediately tried to find a new host to attach her parasitic lifestyle to, namely, me. I deleted her voicemail too. The condo building had strict biometric security. She wasn't getting past the lobby. The final 2 weeks of December blurred into the first week of January 2026. As the days ticked closer to the expiration of the 14-day eviction notice, the panic radiating from the suburbs reached a fever pitch. On January 2nd, I sat in Nate's Buckhead law office to finalize the logistics of the eviction. The sky outside was a bleak slate gray. "They missed the deadline to file a legal contest to the eviction," Nate informed me, leaning back in his leather chair and tapping a silver pen against his legal pad. Which isn't surprising. Filing a contest requires an attorney, and an attorney requires a retainer fee. Since you froze the joint account, your mother's discretionary income is effectively zero. "Has she tried reaching out to you directly?" I asked. Nate chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Oh, Barbara called my receptionist 4 times yesterday. She tried to demand a cease and desist order. When my paralegal informed her that she has no legal standing, she pivoted to screaming that the quitclaim deed was fraudulent. It's the flailing of a drowning woman. But Eleanor, there is a much larger storm brewing that you need to be aware of. He pulled a fresh, sealed folder from his desk drawer and slid it toward me. My forensic accounting team finished the deep dive on Derek's offshore wire transfers, Nate said, his tone dropping its usual casual arrogance and becoming dead serious. We aren't just talking about a guy who made some bad trades on a retail app. The sheer volume of money moving through those Cypriot accounts, combined with the fact that he was intentionally masking the origin of the funds, triggered several automated banking alerts. I frowned, tracing the edge of the folder. Alerts for what? Money laundering and wire fraud, Nate stated plainly. Derek wasn't just losing your money on the Forex market. Based on the transaction ledgers, it looks like he was acting as an unlicensed intermediary for other people's money too. Those creditors he was terrified of on Christmas Eve, they aren't banks, they're private, unregulated syndicates. And worst of all, because he tried to leverage the house to cover his losses by forging your father's signature on a federally regulated loan application, well, he crossed a very bright red line. A chill ran down my spine, though not out of fear for myself. I was completely insulated. The feds? Nate nodded slowly. I have it on very good authority from a colleague at the U.S. Attorney's Office that the IRS Criminal Investigation Division has officially opened a file on Derek. When a guy tries to pull a fraudulent $200,000 HELOC to pay off offshore gambling debts, the algorithms notice. He's looking at federal indictment territory, Eleanor. The eviction is going to be the absolute least of his problems. And my parents? I asked. I didn't care about Derek's freedom, but I needed to know the blast radius. Your father is legally in the clear, seeing as his signature was forged, Nate replied. Your mother, however, is walking a razor-thin line. She co-signed the joint account and authorized the wire transfers to Derek's LLC. If the IRS decides to go scorched earth, they could theoretically look at her as an accessory to financial fraud. I doubt they will pursue a 62-year-old housewife, but the threat alone is going to absolutely shatter whatever remains of her social standing. Good, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Let it shatter. The final breaking point for my family didn't happen in a courtroom. It happened in the driveway of the house they were about to lose. On the evening of January 5th, exactly 2 days before the eviction deadline, my cell phone rang. It wasn't a block number. It was Arthur's cell phone. Against my better judgment, and mostly because I needed to ensure they were actually packing their belongings, I answered. Dad, I said crisply, you have 48 hours. Are the moving boxes packed? There was no answer from my father. Instead, the sound of ragged, heavy sobbing came through the speaker. It was a pathetic, broken sound that I almost didn't recognize. Eleanor. It was Barbara. But all the venom, the superiority, and the narcissistic rage were completely gone. She sounded like an old, terrified woman. Where is Dad, Barbara? I asked, refusing to engage with the tears. He's in the garage. He won't come out. She wept, her breath hitching painfully. Ellie, please, you have to listen to me. You have to help me. She left. She actually left. I leaned against my kitchen counter, watching the city lights flicker outside my window. Who left? Chloe, my mother wailed, the devastation in her voice entirely raw and unscripted. She packed up Madison and Harper. She took all her designer bags, her jewelry, everything. She loaded up her Lexus and drove away. She didn't even say goodbye to me, Ellie. She just walked right past me. I closed my eyes. The poetic justice was almost too perfectly orchestrated to be real. Barbara had spent 32 years worshiping the ground Chloe walked on. She had sacrificed my mental health, my self-esteem, and my financial security to build a protective fortress around her golden child. She had actively aided and abetted Derek's financial crimes just to ensure Chloe never had to work a day in her life. And the moment the money dried up, the golden child didn't hesitate to abandon her mother in a sinking ship. Where did she go? I asked, purely out of logistical curiosity. She's moving into her friend Sarah's cramped apartment in Midtown, Barbara sobbed. She told Derek she was filing for divorce. She told him he was a deadbeat and a criminal. And Ellie, she looked right at me and blamed me. She said it was my fault for letting him handle the family money. She said I ruined her life. The sheer delusion of Chloe blaming her mother for her own husband's gambling addiction was staggering, but entirely on brand. They were a circle of vipers, finally eating each other alive. And Derek? I asked. He's locked in the guest bedroom, Barbara whispered, her voice dropping into a terrified hush. He's completely paranoid, Ellie. He keeps looking out the blinds. He says there are cars parked on the street watching the house. He says the people he owes money to are coming for him. I'm scared. I'm so incredibly scared. We have nowhere to go. We don't have money for a security deposit on an apartment. You can't let the sheriff throw us out in the snow on Wednesday. I am your mother. You have to save us. I let the silence hang on the line for a long, heavy moment. I listened to her crying. 35 years of emotional abuse, manipulation, and conditional love culminated in this exact phone call. She wanted me to swoop in, write a blank check, and fix the catastrophic mess she had created, just like I always did. Barbara, I said softly, my voice perfectly steady. Do you remember when Lily was standing on that broken stool in the kitchen? The crying on the other end of the line faltered, replaced by a confused, wet sniffle. What? Ellie, why are you bringing that up now? This is an emergency. Because it's the only thing that matters, I told her. You looked at my 6-year-old daughter crying with her hands in the dirty water, and you told me it was building character. You told me that under your roof, you make the rules. You were entirely willing to break a child's spirit just to remind me of my place in your hierarchy. I was just trying to teach her discipline, Barbara pleaded, desperately trying to rewrite history. I love Lily. I love you. I was just stressed. No, Barbara, you don't love me, I corrected her gently, devoid of any anger. You love what I can do for you. You love my credit score. You love my bank account. You loved having a reliable punching bag so you and Chloe could feel superior. But the punching bag bought the deed to the gym. Eleanor, please. You built that monster, Barbara, I interrupted, cutting off her begging. You raised Chloe to be a selfish, entitled parasite who bails the second things get difficult. You allowed Derek to steal my money to fund a gambling addiction so you could show off to your church friends. You dug this grave with your own 2 hands, and now you are angry because I refuse to jump into it with you. We will be homeless, and she screamed, the panic taking over again. You will be exactly where your choices have led you, I replied, feeling the last lingering chain of the black tack snap and fall away from my soul. The sheriff's deputies will arrive at 9 a.m. on January 7th. If you, Arthur, or Derek are still on the property, you will be physically removed for trespassing. Do not call this number again. I hung up. I didn't block the number this time. I didn't need to. I knew she wouldn't call back. The finality in my voice was absolute, and even in her state of sheer panic, she understood that the well was permanently, irreversibly dry. January 6, 2026 was the longest day of the year. I worked from home, unable to focus completely on my risk models. The weather outside was brutal. The temperature had plummeted into the low 20s, and a bitter, freezing wind howled through the high rises of downtown Atlanta. I watched Lily play quietly with her blocks on the living room rug. She was safe. She was warm. She would never grow up believing she had to buy love or endure abuse to earn her place at a table. I was breaking the cycle of generational trauma, and while the process was incredibly violent to the family structure, it was fundamentally necessary. Late that evening, after Lily was asleep, my phone buzzed with a text message from Nate. Just got a heads up from my contact at the U.S. Attorney's Office. Tomorrow morning isn't just an eviction. The CID is making their move. Derek's offshore brokers rolled on him to save themselves. The feds are executing an arrest warrant simultaneously with the sheriff's lockout. I stared at the glowing screen in the dark of my kitchen. The house of cards wasn't just collapsing, it was being obliterated. Derek wasn't just losing his free ride, he was losing his freedom. And my parents, who had enabled his arrogance for years, were going to have a front row seat to the destruction of their golden son-in-law. I typed a brief reply to Nate. Let me know when the property is secured. I want a private security contractor on site by noon to change the locks. I set the phone face down on the marble counter, walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, and looked out over the freezing, glittering city. Tomorrow, the past would officially be evicted, and for the first time in my life, I was entirely ready for the future. The morning of January 7th, 2026, dawned with a brutal, biting cold. The temperature in the Atlanta suburbs had dropped to 19 degrees overnight, leaving a thick, glittering layer of frost over the manicured lawns and the rooftops of my parents' neighborhood. I didn't take the day off work. I didn't need to. I had a 10 a.m. conference call with my risk management team, but at 8:15 a.m., I sat in the heated leather seat of my SUV, parked discreetly down the street from the sprawling colonial house. I wasn't there to gloat. I was there strictly in a professional capacity as the fiduciary of Lily's future trust to ensure the asset was properly secured once the eviction was executed. Nate, my attorney, was already on site, parked in his sleek Mercedes, sipping coffee and waiting for the authorities to arrive. At exactly 8:55 a.m., the quiet suburban street was disrupted by the arrival of 2 Fulton County Sheriff's Department cruisers. They pulled into the driveway, their tires crunching loudly on the frosted concrete. Right behind them was a large, unmarked moving truck hired by Nate to execute the physical lockout. I watched through my tinted windshield as 2 uniformed deputies stepped out of their vehicles and walked up the front steps. They didn't knock politely. They pounded on the heavy mahogany door with the flat of their hands. It took a full minute before the door opened. My father, Arthur, stood in the doorway. Even from down the street, I could see how small and defeated he looked. He was wearing an oversized flannel shirt. His shoulders slumped as the deputies handed him the official court-ordered writ of possession. A moment later, Barbara appeared. She wasn't wearing her flawless makeup or her country club pearls. She was wearing a bathrobe, her hair disheveled, frantically waving her arms at the deputies. I rolled my window down just a crack, letting the freezing air into the cabin, and caught the faint, shrill echoes of her hysteria carrying down the quiet street. "You can't do this! It's freezing outside! We need more time! My husband is a sick man!" The deputies, completely unfazed by suburban theatrics, simply stepped past her into the foyer. The legal grace period was over. The house no longer belonged to them, and the law was entirely indifferent to her tears. The movers immediately went to work. They began carrying boxes, dining room chairs, and the expensive patio furniture out the front door, depositing them unceremoniously onto the frost-covered grass near the curb. Neighbors started peeking out of their windows. The woman across the street, who Barbara had spent years trying to impress at neighborhood association meetings, stepped out onto her porch, tightly wrapping her cardigan around herself, watching in absolute shock as my parents' fake empire was dismantled box by box. Then, the situation escalated from humiliating to catastrophic. Just as Barbara was screaming at a mover to be careful with a crystal vase, 3 unmarked black Ford Explorers turned sharply onto the street. They didn't park politely against the curb. They aggressively boxed in the driveway, completely blocking the sheriff's cruisers and the moving truck. 6 men and women wearing dark tactical jackets stepped out. Emblazoned across the backs of their jackets in bold, bright yellow letters were the initials: IRS, CID. The Internal Revenue Service's Criminal Investigation Division had arrived. Nate stepped out of his car, adjusting his overcoat, and exchanged a brief professional nod with the lead federal agent. Barbara stopped screaming at the movers. She froze on the front steps, staring at the federal agents marching up her driveway. Arthur dropped a box of framed photographs, the glass shattering on the concrete. "Derek Hayes!" the lead agent barked, his voice booming with undeniable authority. "Federal agents! Step out of the residence!" For a moment, nothing happened. Then the front door opened wider, and Derek was practically dragged out onto the porch by a sheriff's deputy who had found him hiding in the upstairs guest bedroom. Derek looked nothing like the arrogant, self-proclaimed visionary who had lectured me about macroeconomic strategies. He was wearing sweatpants and a wrinkled t-shirt. He was pale, sweating profusely despite the freezing cold, and trembling uncontrollably. "Derek Hayes, you are under arrest for multiple counts of wire fraud, bank fraud, and operating an unlicensed money transmitting business," the agent announced, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. Wait, no!" Derek sobbed, his voice cracking violently as the agent spun him around and pushed him face first against the brick pillar of the front porch. "I was just investing. It was an offshore broker. I didn't know the funds were dirty. You have to call my lawyer." "You can call whoever you want from Federal Holding," the agent replied coldly, snapping the handcuffs tightly shut around Derek's wrists. Barbara let out a horrific guttural wail. She collapsed onto her knees on the frosted front lawn, clutching her face as the federal agents marched her golden son-in-law down the driveway. The neighbors were no longer just peeking. Several were standing on their lawns with their smartphones out, recording the absolute destruction of the family's social standing. As they loaded Derek into the back of the black SUV, Barbara's frantic, tear-filled eyes scanned the street. She saw my SUV. She recognized the license plate. She scrambled up from the freezing grass, her bathrobe flapping in the wind, and ran down the sidewalk toward my car. She slammed her open palms against my passenger side window. "Eleanor!" she screamed, her face pressed against the glass, her breath fogging the window. "Tell them to stop. You have the money. Call your corporate lawyers. They're taking him away. Ellie, please. He's your family." I sat perfectly still in the driver's seat. I didn't feel a shred of the guilt she was desperately trying to trigger. I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of closure. I pressed the button, lowering the window exactly 2 inches. The freezing winter air rushed in, carrying the smell of exhaust and her desperate perfume. "He isn't my family, Barbara," I said, my voice calm, flat, and completely devoid of empathy. "He is a federal criminal who stole my money, and you are the accomplice who held the door open for him." "You did this!" she shrieked, the tears streaming down her red, freezing cheeks. "You destroyed us because you were jealous of Chloe. You are a monster." "I didn't destroy anything," I replied softly, looking her dead in the eyes. "I just stopped paying for the illusion. Enjoy your new reality." I pressed the button, rolling the window up, entirely cutting off her screams. I put the SUV in drive, signaled, and pulled smoothly away from the curb. I checked my rearview mirror one last time. I saw my mother standing alone on the frozen street, surrounded by boxes of her useless, expensive belongings, watching the federal agents drive away with the man she had chosen over her own daughter. The black tax was permanently canceled. Late February 2026, the Atlanta housing market in the early spring of 2026 was historically aggressive. Inventory was incredibly low, and buyers were desperate for turnkey properties in premium suburban school districts. As a risk analyst, I know that emotion has absolutely no place in a financial portfolio. The old me, the wounded, traumatized daughter, might have wanted to hire a bulldozer and smash that colonial house into splinters just for the sheer cinematic revenge of it. But destroying a high-yield asset because of bad memories is a terrible investment strategy. Instead, the moment the locks were changed in January, I hired an elite, ruthless general contracting firm. They went in and completely sterilized the property. They tore out Barbara's outdated, gaudy floral wallpaper. They ripped up the carpets and polished the original hardwood floors until they gleamed. They completely gutted the kitchen, throwing away the broken wooden stool and installing a massive modern quartz island and state-of-the-art appliances. They painted every single wall a crisp, clean, neutral white. They erased every single trace of my family's toxic footprint. By the second week of February, the house was professionally staged and listed on the market. It didn't even make it to the weekend open house. We received 5 cash offers within 24 hours, triggering a massive bidding war. I sold the property to a young, dual-income couple relocating from Seattle for $640,000, a massive premium over the original debt I had purchased 4 years prior. When the wire transfer hit the Lily's Future Trust account, I didn't buy a sports car or designer clothes. I executed a precise, calculated wealth-building strategy. Half of the net profit was immediately transferred into an irrevocable, aggressive growth index fund entirely in Lily's name. It was locked down tight. She wouldn't be able to touch the principal until she turned 25, but it virtually guaranteed that my daughter would never have to take out a student loan, struggle for a down payment on her own house, or ever rely on anyone else for her financial independence. The other half of the profit was routed into a specialized philanthropic account I had established through Nate's law firm. It was named the Resilient Mother Scholarship. It was an anonymous, fully funded endowment designed specifically to pay for the childcare and tuition of single mothers returning to college to get their degrees in finance and economics. I took the trauma my family had inflicted on me and weaponized it into pure, compounding generational wealth for women who actually deserved it. As for my blood relatives, the universe handed them the exact balance sheet they had earned. With no money, no credit, and an active federal investigation breathing down their necks, Arthur and Barbara were forced to move into a cramped, poorly insulated 2-bedroom apartment in a deteriorating complex on the far outskirts of the city. There were no country club luncheons. There were no church choir solos. There was only the heavy, suffocating reality of living on Arthur's meager Social Security check. And in a twist of absolute, undeniable irony, Chloe and her 2 daughters were forced to move into that tiny apartment with them. Chloe had quickly realized that her friend Sarah's hospitality had an expiration date. Stripped of her leased Lexus and her designer wardrobe, the golden child was finally forced to get a minimum wage job as a receptionist at a dental clinic just to help pay her parents' electric bill. Barbara now spent her days trapped in a tiny living room, forced to babysit Madison and Harper for free, while Chloe constantly blamed her for the destruction of her marriage. The toxic ecosystem they had built had finally locked them inside with each other. Derek, meanwhile, was sitting in a federal holding facility, denied bail due to his status as a flight risk with offshore ties. He was facing a minimum of 8 to 10 years in federal prison for wire fraud. There were no candlestick charts or bullish divergences in his cell, just concrete and the absolute certainty that he was a failure. On a bright, unusually warm Saturday morning in late February, I walked out of my downtown condo holding Lily's hand. She was wearing a bright yellow sundress and her favorite denim jacket. She was skipping happily, completely unburdened by the shadows of the past. "Mommy, can we go to the big bookstore today?" Lily asked, looking up at me with her bright, intelligent eyes. "I want to get the new book about the planets and maybe a hot chocolate." "We can get whatever books you want, sweetie," I smiled, squeezing her hand, "and 2 hot chocolates." We walked to the parking garage and climbed into my SUV. I buckled her in, making sure she was perfectly safe. Before I shifted the car into drive, I adjusted my rearview mirror. I didn't see a woman weighed down by guilt. I didn't see a human ATM or a punching bag or a daughter desperate for conditional love. I saw Eleanor, a senior risk analyst, a fiercely protective mother, a woman who had successfully identified a catastrophic liability, executed a flawless liquidation, and secured a brilliant, untouchable future. I smiled at my reflection, put the car in gear, and drove my daughter out into a beautiful, clear blue city, leaving the ghosts of the suburbs permanently in the rear view.